Okay, but I'd like to open by saying that on the train coming up, I read through all of the abstracts, and I thought they were really engaging. So much so that I went through all of the wonderful Scottish countryside without even noticing it. So I really do think they're very good work. I was very engaged with it. I want to take you through a train of thought that I'd been having recently. So all of this is very new to me as well, the way that I'm thinking about it. In 2003-04, we were thinking about the book, The Ethical Consumer, and we were getting into the process of beginning the editing. And we wanted the first chapter to be philosophy, so the philosophy of consumption ethics. But of course, at that time, this is before David Schwartz's excellent book on that, and before Peter Wenz had been writing. So as far as we could see, there weren't philosophers writing even anything about consumption, let alone the ethics of it. So we contacted Peter Singer. Peter Singer's book, How Shall We Live, I think it was, has about a sentence in it on consumption, maybe a paragraph, but if so, it's a very short paragraph. But we thought, anyway, he might be able to do something for us. And of course, he was far too busy, as you'd expect. But he pointed us in the direction of Philip Cafaro. And Philip said that he was prepared to write something of the chapter, but not the whole chapter. So we were making some progress. And the only other person that we knew that might be able to help, really, was Clive Barnett. Clive Barnett, a geographer, was in very early stages, just about to undertake some research, but he wanted to put down a marker in philosophy before he really got going. And so he was quite keen, and he started writing the chapter. We put the two of them in touch with each other and sat back waiting for our chapter to arrive, but it didn't. And it soon became clear that the two were struggling to work together. And I'll illustrate why they were struggling to work together by two short extracts from things that they subsequently had written. So here we are, Philip Cafaro, and he's writing about the environment. So he says, "We consumers harm nature because we are ignorant, selfish, gluttonous, arrogant, greedy, and apathetic." Clive Barnett and his crew write a bit later, "We see people as consumers as exhibiting existing dispositions of care, concern, and solidarity that can be mobilized through new social movements." Well, there's a big difference between them. Philip Cafaro is an American and researching in America. Clive Barnett is in the UK. Philip Cafaro is talking about the environment. Clive Barnett is talking about fair trade. So there are differences, but the point is, when we got them together to do something theoretical, it was obvious that their understandings of human nature were diametrically opposed. And that's why my name is the third author, because it was my job to try to get something that the two of them could agree on. And I don't think, in the end, I think it's fair to say that Philip never really quite agreed, as you can see from the way that he writes. So that's in our area of study. There is that diversity of understanding about human nature. And then I thought it would be quite interesting to see if I could fit Tim Dunleavy in there. Divini, sorry. So here he is with The Ethical Consumer is little more than a myth that belies the reality of individual behaviour. But for Tim, whilst we have this self-interested side and we have a caring side, nevertheless, when we are situated in the decision-making context, we usually go to the self-interest. And that's why he's not keen to accept the idea of consumer care. So it interested me that he kind of was not as extreme, as it were, as Philip. So my starting point was this, that there is this great diversity in our understanding of human nature. And it's... Have I got to say something very important now, I suppose? Don't often get a drum roll. Okay, so, but not only obviously in our own area of interest, you know, we see this elsewhere, don't we? I mean, we only have to look at The Economist, and here we've got Gary Becker. I think he died recently, but he was very influential. And he says what we all know, that, you know, most economists, self-interest is assumed to dominate over other motives for the economists. Where when you get an anthropologist, a prominent one like Daniel Miller, he will go and live on an estate somewhere or a road somewhere and really get to know the people. And he says, with few exceptions, sees his participants exhibiting love and care in families and occasionally care for people beyond. So again, we get this sort of terrific difference in assumptions. And in this case, we could argue that this is something to do with the disciplines. So most economists do subscribe to this idea, but not all. And most anthropologists get quite close to the people that they study and find them, you know, quite agreeable. But as I said, it's not entirely down to particular disciplines, but there are differences in the methods that they use. So the economists, everything is highly theoretical, so it's at arm's length, generally speaking. I mean, I'm thinking of classical economists here. And anthropologists tend always to get their hands dirty and they go into the field and they get to know people. So it could be something down to particular ways of researching. And then at the first of our seminars here, we had John Ferguson, a psychologist, and Kate Soper, a philosopher. And although I think they had a very similar view of human nature, in the sense that they both saw a self-interested side and a more altruistic side, they took a very different view as to how we might be motivated. So John argued that if you want to change people's behaviour to become more sustainable, as we speak, you need to engage their altruism. And you do this because if you engage their self-interest, it's prudential. They only do it while it is in their self-interest. So they'll stop doing it if it no longer is in their self-interest. So you have to engage their altruism to be able to make the behaviour stick. Kate Soper argued the other way around, that she didn't think by trying to engage people's altruism that you could get them to behave in the way that we would like them to a greater, for sustainability. She said you have to engage their self-interest in some better world. And, you know, if you've all read the books, it's, you know, riding down a tree-lined road with the birds singing and not a car in sight kind of thing. It's got to be wonderful, hasn't it? So let's go for that. So although they had similar ideas about a kind of interplay between self-interest and altruism, they nevertheless came to different conclusions as to how we might motivate people. So I first started thinking, well, how should we understand this? And so in what kind of context can we make sense of this? And there's the obvious possibility of socio-political understandings that we all have a politics, and if we bring that to our work, then we are going to have different views that we sort of espouse of what human beings are like. As we've said, methodological differences would seem to account for some of it. Disciplinary differences, well, it does seem as if some disciplines particularly have a view that they bring to the discipline, not entirely, but there does seem to be a dominant view, although that couldn't account for enough of it, because philosophers have long argued about whether we are born self-interested and we have to be trained to be more social, or whether we are born innocent and we become corrupted. So they've argued about that for a long time, so it's not just a disciplinary thing. And then I wondered really, not that I know much about evolutionary psychology, but have we evolved in such a way that our human behavior is very, very complex, and simply it is easy for people to look at it in different ways and come to different conclusions? Though I have no answers to those, but those are the kind of questions that seem to come to mind. Sometimes people don't actually tell you what their understanding of human nature is, but you can sort of make some guesses from the way that they're writing. So these are a bunch of writers taking us right through from Carol Scott in America in the 1970s, so sort of from our point of view, kind of quite early work in our area, through to Terence Swatowski's much more recent, and I'm sure there are more recent ones. These are all in marketing, so they have a particular interest in changing behavior. But my point is that all of them believe that behavior can be changed, otherwise, presumably, they wouldn't be writing these papers about how we can modify socially conscious behavior and how we can encourage people to buy more fair trade. So we can read into them that they have an understanding of human nature that is, to an extent, malleable and can be affected. So what potential is there in human nature for sort of changing behavior and perhaps going deeper than that? And so, think about social marketing and other forms of marketing. Bearing in mind still, of course, that if we go back to the economists, preferences are assumed not to change substantially over time. So there are those disciplines who think of things as being much more fixed. And then I thought about, well, what spaces could we examine that might in some way give us insights into whether human nature does change, how it could develop, those kind of things. And of course, Andreas's work is one of those. Space and place acts as a destination and can form a supportive environment or kind of social capital that allows similar initiatives and movements to emerge. So when we think of these areas that are kind of carved out of consumer culture more generally, and the expectation is that it will allow different practices to emerge. What does that do to kind of human nature over time and behaviors? I suppose that would mean some kind of longitudinal study in those particular areas with very tricky methodologies to try and measure those sort of things. But that seemed to me to be a sort of a fairly promising area that we might consider that in, and I know those kind of studies are still continuing. But then I thought about, well, what about times of substantial change, actually times of social engineering, when we are encouraged in one direction or the other? And the easiest of these, of course, were the ones where we were all encouraged to be more self-interested. They are very easy to find. And so the immediate thing that I thought of was E.P. Thompson's work, the historian, when he documented the change in the UK from what he refers to as a moral economy to a market-based economy. And I mean, although he refers to the traditional economy as a moral economy, it wasn't entirely moral, but it did have moral aspects to it. And he tells us about that if you produced corn in an area, you were expected to benefit the people who lived in that area, so it would be sold at the market in that area. I believe I remember reading that there was a kind of unwritten rule in the market that the poorer people would be allowed to buy first at a fixed rate that they were capable of paying. So there were lots of little rules in there, moral rules, that were swept away during this period of time when there was a deliberate intervention to change this into a self-interested market system. But of course, that's way back in time. So, but there are more recent things. So I was interested when I was looking at this piece about Thailand, that during the 1960s, Thailand was moved into a global market. So it needed to be a consumer culture. But of course, it's Buddhist, and the Buddhists teach contentment. So how can you have a consumer culture with contentment? Because the first thing you buy is fine. That'll last forever, that's great. And you don't buy anything else. So they suppressed the Buddhist teaching on contentment in order to get their consumer culture going. So again, a deliberate social engineering at that point in time. And of course, our classic one, and this is Don Slater, the sociologist, recording that time, during the 1980s and of course the Thatcher period, where he says, legitimized unabashedly, the administration legitimized unabashedly self-interested consumption. And so we were all literally encouraged to consume for our own interest. So these were periods of deliberate attempts at change towards self-interest. And then I began to struggle to see what were the periods where we were deliberately encouraged to be more altruistic. One of the classics, and I know very little about it, because as I say, this is a line of thinking that I've been going through, and I might read more on these, but was of the great warrior, Indian warrior Ashoka. And after one of particularly bloody wars that he won, he got to thinking that probably wasn't the best way of going about life, and decided that we would be much better off if we were far more compassionate. And so we get these stones, carved stones, with a lot of edicts in it, saying we must be kind to all creatures. We must be kind to each other. And so it was a deliberate attempt on his part, seemingly, to try and move his nation towards a more compassionate view. But apparently, we just have these 33 lumps of stone with their writing on to go on. So it's not very easy to examine what actually happened here. But then, like a lot of people, I suppose, I got interested in this idea that a number of areas are trying to move away from the measures of gross domestic product, which don't actually help us with this, because if you make more bombs, then everybody's happy because the gross domestic product goes up. So that kind of is not a very useful measure. And of course, people are looking for better measures that measure things like happiness. And as we know, even our present government toyed with that for about 5 minutes. But some of the countries and areas that I'm now learning are trying to do something about this is Bhutan, which, although I know it has problems, but seems to be in the forefront of experimenting with these kind of measures. Costa Rica, Brazil, Japan, and Alberta in Canada. I've researched these any further, so I don't know quite what to think about them. But on the other hand, these kind of measures have things like cooperation, measures for cooperation and voluntary work. So they are kind of surrogates for altruism in there, although they're not they won't be accurate. But if you see the amount of voluntary work going up, if you see the amount of cooperation going up, it might give us a sense of changes occurring. So then I thought, well, I know nothing about neuroscience, but it appears to me that at this stage I need to know something, because is the brain capable of making changes if we have those kind of social engineering? Either way, when we were all moved towards self-interest, did our brains change towards self-interest? When we were all moved towards altruism, did our brains move towards altruism? So I start looking at the neuroscience work. And I've read one paper so far, and even that's a lie, because I didn't read the whole paper. I looked at the introduction and the kind of proposal bit, and then I looked rather wide-eyed and blank at a lot of figures and things that I didn't understand, and then I read the discussion and conclusion. But I read enough to be able to be sure that this was very interesting for our field. Okay, and bear in mind when I talk about this, I am naive in neuroscience, but it is just simply that it is very interesting to the kind of things that we want to do. Their introduction says that the neuroscientists have moved away from the model that our brain matures at a certain point in life, and then it doesn't change much except that it declines at my stage of life, which is a bit depressing, really. But their new thinking is different to that, and it's much more cheerful from a point of view of some of my age. What they say is the brain is constantly changing, and that goes on throughout life, and it's constantly rebuilding, and it goes on throughout life. And it is responding to the way that we use it, in a sense, which seems slightly strange to me. So that if we begin thinking in a different way, it will fire up elsewhere to process that thinking, and that not only will be functionally different, but it will also be physically different, because it will build the area that you're using, and other areas that you're using less will decline. So that they call this brain plasticity. So this is much more encouraging to me as a person of my age, but it is slightly frightening in the sense that the answer to, if we're encouraged to be more self-interested, do our brains change in that direction? The answer's kind of looking like yes. And vice versa if we move towards compassion. But the other bit that really interested me is that they were doing experiments. And so, slightly misrepresenting what they do, they grabbed a lot of people off the street, hauled them in, wired them up, and showed them pictures of people in distress. Because they were interested in empathy. Would people empathize with those in the pictures they saw? And what happened is that their brains fired up, and they fired up on a negative area, an area that the neuroscientists would associate with states of distress and pain. So they were empathizing with distress and pain that the people were feeling. And they theorized that this is why we get burnout, that we do go and help, but eventually the stress is so much that we remove ourselves at some point. But then they rushed out into the street again and grabbed a bunch of Buddhists and hauled them in and wired them up. They made sure that each of these Buddhists had been practicing for very many years. And of course, what they had been practicing was compassion for all sentient beings. And what they found out when they showed them the same pictures, and they were all wired up, is that they fired up on the pleasure side of the brain. Now, when I say side, don't think that these are the right areas of the brain that I'm pointing to. They're arbitrary as far as I'm concerned, okay? But what they said is that this really surprised them because they were firing up on pleasure. This didn't mean that the Buddhists were looking at it and thinking, whoa, you know, they're in pain, this is great. What it was about was that there was a warmth and affiliation. So there was an affiliation that these people are like me and we are together in this world. And the warmth was, this represents an opportunity for me to be with and help others. So there was a kind of a pleasure in the possibility of being able to help. And this is interesting because in consumption ethics, we are interested usually in empathy for others. But actually, of course, if we do encourage empathy for others, it seems it is quite a negative feeling and it simply isn't going to last. But if it's around compassion and that's on the positive side, then that brain plasticity, which means, what I should say is, of course, this means that part of the brain, if you practice it, expands and does more work, is capable of doing more work. But what that got me to thinking back was to Kate Soper again, because if her idea about this kind of wonderful possible world relates to the idea of a compassion rather than empathy, empathy being the negative feelings, but she wants the positive feelings, so it sort of ties in with the brand of virtue theory, endomonia, that she speaks about, that actually we would get pleasure out of a more altruistic approach. So that was my train of thinking so far, and it probably means that I'm going to read a bit more neuroscience, but I mean, part of why I did that is because I think that thinking along these lines seems always to take me into other disciplines, which I know nothing about, but then have to work on and never become an expert, but that we could engage much more with people from disciplines that we hadn't perhaps anticipated before to do work. So, altruism, is it fixed and in short supply, as some economists would say? I mean, one of the reasons that economists go for self-interest is because if they believe that altruism is in short supply, then much of the good work has to be done through self-interest. Well, if we have a very different view, this idea that we can, our brains are malleable, then that doesn't need to be the case. So how should we understand human nature and behavior during these times of social engineering? It would be really good to try and examine that in some way. And to what extent does consumption change during these periods of social engineering? But that's about as far as I got in my thinking, except that I then began to reflect, well, if I've looked at self-interest, then human nature. What was my view? So I started thinking back to what I'd been influenced by. And I think prime influence is this lady here, Mary Midgley. I think she's still alive. Last time I looked on the internet, she was. She's about, I think, 96 now. I put the picture, she's not a woman that you would disagree with. And I was particularly taken by The Ethical Primate, her book. And one of the things that she does in that is that she takes the behaviourist to task. And you'll see why I want to argue on that. And she particularly doesn't like Skinner. The behaviourists actually had an interesting case, and there's not time to go into that, but basically it's saying, the behaviourists are saying that something happens in the environment, stimulates action, and you act. You think about it afterwards and make up a story as to why you've acted. And what she says is, she asks, how would environmental pressure so affect Skinner or his opponents as to produce passages of prose like his book without any mediating process of their minds? So she's read his wonderful book, and she says, what stimuli caused this without you thinking about it? And so not that she made a Midgley test, but I've used her work to make a Midgley test. This is Midgley test 1. Can the proposed theory of human behaviour account for the author's behaviour? So very often, as in the case of the economists again, they say, it's all about self-interest. Well, that means the economist who's writing it is also, by definition, self-interested only. Okay, so I think that for me is an excellent test. Do think about yourself when you're thinking of what your theory of human behaviour is. The second bit of that I like from her work is she says very early on, our moral freedom is not something biologically bizarre. No denial of the reality of ethics, nothing offensive to its dignity, follows from accepting our evolutionary origin. To the contrary, human moral capacities are just what could be expected to evolve when a highly social creature becomes intelligent enough to become aware of profound contradictions in its motives. So basically, what we observe in ourselves, these attempts to try and make sense of the world in ethical terms, is exactly what you would expect. There's nothing that demeans ethics in any of that. So I suppose my Midgley test too is the proposed theory of human behaviour consistent with an evolved primate? Okay, so we always have to think, we've evolved to the point where we see all of these difficulties. Is human nature what we would expect from that? So I particularly liked her work. But then, because we're in the Adam Smith Institute, we've got to do a bit of Adam Smith. So at the moment, I'm about halfway through one of his books. So again, no expert, but it does seem to me that he does get misrepresented, although he saw self-interest as working to the good in certain circumstances. He clearly didn't think that it was the thing that we should encourage. How selfish soever man may be supposed, he only spoke about men. I think probably women will be much the same. There are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him. That's the classic statement that people use to sort of confront this idea of selfishness. But also, he actually doesn't like extreme selfishness, because he says, how disagreeable does he appear to be, whose hard and obdurate heart feels for himself only, but is altogether insensible to the happiness and misery of others. This man is not going to promote self-interest to the point that it overrides everything else. And I think I agree with both of his statements there. How much self-interest do we have? Well, he says, we may generally expect a considerable degree of virtue. And fortunately for the good morals of society, these are the situations in the far greater part of humankind. I had to put human in there rather than mankind. But he is actually quite variable. As you read through, sometimes he's quite optimistic and says, actually, generally people are pretty good when you go around the world. And other times he says, oh dear, I despair of them occasionally. So he does have a kind of variable view of human nature. And I suppose if you go around from place to place, and he's a great observer, you would see differing amounts of self-interest and concern for others. And then the bit that interested me most, because it sort of brought me full circle, to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature. Now, that brought me back to the brain, because actually he's talking very much like the neuroscientists now, because he's saying the brain is perfectible. We can change our human nature. It can be changed, and it is towards benevolence that we should be engaging. So I find myself sort of quite happy with both of those writers. So, what I would conclude from those things then, very preliminary conclusions. I think our area of consumption ethics has developed a very long way, as Deirdre said, from the first time when it was just so difficult to find anyone else working in the area, and you were sort of over the moon if you did find someone. And we're now a big research community, and we're doing great and varied stuff. So I think we are a sufficient study group to be able to be more reflexive than perhaps we always have been. So to look back through some of our work and kind of tease out some of the emerging problems. Sorry. Oh, that's the drum roll, isn't it? It's me. You can cut those out, I guess. Unless you want everybody to laugh about them. Okay. I think in some ways it might be better if we're more explicit about our understandings of human nature in the work that we write, at least referring to someone else's work and saying, we're in agreement with this kind of view of human nature. I think we should not subscribe to theories that fail the Midgley tests. You may disagree, we'll see. And I think that this area, like many other areas, as you follow the arguments in consumption ethics, it inevitably, I think, takes you across disciplines. And although we have been interdisciplinary to a certain extent, there are people from different disciplines here, I think we could be much more adventurous with the way that we work across disciplines now, trying to not do perhaps what I'm doing, which is dipping into areas that I know very little about and then saying something about them, but actually collaborating with people from those areas so that you get the best of both pieces of expertise. So that's why I'm so supportive of seminar series like these that do encourage that kind of work across disciplines. So that's it, really. That's my references. So shall we discuss?
I just had a quick question, and it was around, you talked about for example, you gave a number of examples of suppression. So perhaps where alternative views of ethics or consumption have been suppressed perhaps throughout history or different cultures. And you talked specifically about suppression of the Buddhist teaching of contentment in Thailand, which is clearly very interesting. And what I'm interested in is who is doing the suppressing? Is it the market? Are kind of external institutions? Who are the suppressors in this particular dynamic?
Okay, in that particular case, as I understand it, there was a plan drawn up by the government to move Thailand into the global economy. And I mean, that's understandable. But of course, yes, they realized that this was in the way. And so they went to the Buddhist communities and said, you must stop teaching that. So it was a government policy. An overt policy, not, I don't know if it was a 5-year plan, but it was a plan drawn up to pull the country into the global economy. But I only have one reference point for it. So, I mean, a lot of this is stuff that I've been working through, and all of it now needs kind of cross verifying, I think, because it's... That's possible. It's only 1960s, though. I mean, there must have been other people writing about it, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, sometimes these things are entirely deliberate. I mean, as I was probably saying, there was the McCarthy era in America certainly suppressed certain ideas about giving information to consumers. Writing that argued that consumers should be given full information to be able to make logical decisions was struck out. It was literally taken out of the books. So we all know about Taylorism.
Yes. But
actually we don't know about all of Taylorism. We only know a tiny bit of it. There are other bits that sort of just appear not to capture interest and get lost.
And just disappear.
Just disappear, yeah. And I think, I don't know, I feel as if the neoliberal economics policies have been so dominant that other things seem to have not caught hold in academia.
Yes, not really gotten the traction.
Yeah, that's right, as they perhaps should have done. So, we were discussing, can we keep this research group going? Because there are examples of these things disappearing. So that's what's so wonderful about seeing you guys coming forward and doing your work in the area.
Well, it certainly helps when you can get funded.
Yes, that's what you were saying, isn't it? But it's what gets funded is because the neoliberal ideas do get terrific funding.
Absolutely.
I mean, I suppose any of us in marketing will know that it's a damn sight easier to get funding for ideas that are, along the standard marketing lines than it is to get sort of outside.
Alternative outside ideas, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about something which is, is the term altruism appropriate for this type of consideration? For example, if somebody does a good deed to help somebody who needs help, there's clearly an altruistic output. But if we modify our consumer behavior, it isn't clear in a sense that this is going to change the wider structural forces of the destruction of our ecology.
Yeah.
We cannot see, if you like, that endpoint. So perhaps another way of thinking about it is that it could be a sort of narcissistic fulfillment, for example, that it's a gesture. But we all know, in a sense, that modifying our individual consumer behavior isn't going to impact in a broad or meaningful sense. So in that sense, is altruism the correct term for what we're talking about?
Well, I suppose first of all, I think that all motivations are complicated or complex, and we can't sort of bring out and say that this is purely altruistic, this is purely self-interested, that there'll always be kind of mixtures in there. And I think Kant says, no matter how long we sit and try to understand our own motivations, we can't. We can only have a sense of them. We can never kind of pin them down. I'm loath to lose the word altruism because when I was doing my doctoral study, I was talking to an economist, and it didn't matter what piece of behaviour I mentioned, he reported it as self-interested. So, if someone jumped into a lake to save someone else, they were hoping to get reported in the paper the next day and get praised for it. And, even if they gave their life, it was still self-interest. What it seemed to me that would do is to collapse our language, because actually our language is easy to completely collapse. It's made of distinctions that suit us being able to say something. It's not real in that sense. So I'm kind of slightly loath to collapse language down. I would prefer to have a number of words for what at least appear to be differently motivated behaviours. Whether altruism suggests that there is clearly other-oriented behaviour or not, I don't know. But the other part that you were seeming to say is that if we engineer people to be more altruistic, then that's engineering them to do it, and it's in a sense not real then. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, but of course what they were looking at were people who self-consciously wanted to change themselves. So they were practicing compassion for hours each day to bring themselves to a kind of a happy feeling of openness to the world. So that was the distinction. Okay, that's kind of utopian to think that we're going to go massively along that path. And as you know, I'm a pessimist. I don't think these things are going to happen. I think we're going to hit the buffers. But it just interested me that if the brain is plastic to an extent, there are these opportunities here to make a change that conceivably might have brought us to a good position. But yeah, there are all sorts of difficulties with it, aren't there? But I don't want to collapse the possible terms that we have for describing different things, although I'm painfully aware of how something can be shown as self-interested that I immediately think, oh, that's very caring. Yeah, it's quite easily done, isn't it, with most of these arguments. Does that get anywhere near?
Yeah, just following on from that point about self-interest and altruism, do you believe it's just about persuasiveness and making things easy for the consumer, and then that then affects their brain and the neuroscience? For instance, I was on eBay the other day and it said you want to donate, so we now make things a lot easier for the consumer to be altruistic.
No, I don't think that's the way forward really at all. I think it is a very much a social cultural thing that we have to, like Kate Soper says, maybe we have to get so depressed about the hurried, selfish kind of world that we seem to be heading towards, that we voluntarily want to opt out of that, and actually we start to look like some countries and areas are. They start to look and say, well, can we stop measuring gross domestic product, and we start finding ways of measuring happiness, and we're not successful if we don't measure happiness rising, and so therefore we start thinking about being slower and kinder and all of those kind of things.
Well, it was interesting you mentioned Brazil, because I watched a programme on that the other day, and they were saying it used to be their oil industry, and everyone owned all the land, so lots of rich landlords owned the land, and nobody did anything with it, and now they've sort of parcelled it up, to people that are actually doing something with the land and going organic and everything, and they're much happier as a...
Yes.
So they're going down that route of utopia.
Yeah. But I have to say, I'm not optimistic about those things. But I was just interested that they're mainly in this difference between empathy and compassion. That actually that did. Yes, you'd be interested in that as well. Yes.
Compassion. You said, if I've got this right, Kate Soper talked about compassion, not empathy. Have I got that wrong?
I wasn't saying that Kate Soper actually spoke about that. I was just that the distinction between empathy, which empathy is what we would normally use in the West
Yes.
as the driving force of ethical consumption.
Yeah.
But if it is the thing that fires off the dark side of the brain and gives us worries, then of course we can't expect people to do it. And then when they suggested that compassion fires off the pleasure side of the brain, then that seemed to take me back to Kate Soper's work, because she's looking for pleasure in those kind of reduced consumption, those kind of
And
things.
I was really interested in the words warmth and affiliation and togetherness.
Yeah.
And sort of whether if the brain is malleable and we could move things forward, whether people would feel more warmth and affiliation and togetherness, and that would make them want to do more of the same.
Well, that's what this sort of suggests. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So another question about words, basically. But I was wondering why you chose the term human nature over, let's say, terms such as subjectivities or imaginaries.
Probably because it's not my area of research, and I just kind of go off on a wave of thinking without really examining terms at all. This really is just, this takes me here, this takes me there, this takes me somewhere on, and then I get to a point where I think this is really interesting. So, yes, another shot at this would mean that I'd have to kind of carefully consider stages that go along and improve the terminology. Why? Take me through why you would prefer other ones.
No, I mean, I might be wrong, but I'm just wondering to what extent, talking about human nature per se is in itself essentializing, as if there's something inherent in us, you know, biological or otherwise. Whereas terms such as subjectivity recognizes more explicitly that, our morality is socially constructed to begin with.
That would, yes, that would shift the argument somewhat, wouldn't it? And I'd have to think about it rather differently. Yeah, that would be worth exploring again through with different terms to see what happened, and it might take me to a different discipline. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.